Good morning. Thanks very much for that introduction. Thanks to the organisers of the event today and you, the audience, for attending. It's lovely to be here in Cape Town. Nice to be in South Africa, home of the World Rugby Champions. And I think we can all agree that one of the more inspirational stories, certainly one of the more inspirational speeches that we heard last year, was the South African captain immediately after winning the World Cup. It was inspirational. Unfortunately, this will not be so inspirational and will focus on some of the darker side of sport. My general job is just to talk in general terms about the psychology of cheating. And I think on preparing extensively on Google for this, one thing kept flashing up at me, one book, and it's Rick Riley's book on Donald Trump and why Donald Trump cheats at golf. Now, it's an extraordinary book because he cheats regularly and creatively. Now, my favorite story from the book is that he's 72 and he has a handicap of 3, which places him in the top 5% of golfers of all ages in the US. Now, I want you to compare him to another 70-year-old or golfer in their 70s. You may have heard of him. He was all right, Jack Nicklaus. Jack Nicklaus has a handicap now of 5, which means that in a head-to-head between Trump and Jack Nicklaus, Trump would have to give him 2 shots. If there was a head-to-head over 18 holes of golf between Nicklaus and Trump, who would you be on? Who would your money be on? And the answer is Nicklaus if there's a referee, Trump if there isn't, because Trump cheats. And it's interesting from the book because he's quite a good golfer. He doesn't have to cheat as much as he does, but it's according to the book, it's in his nature. And with that, I just want to stay for a second with the White House because there have been other presidents, and one of the greatest ones was Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln did what all good sports administrators do. He surrounded himself with very, very good people. He made one mistake in that one of his secretaries of war was a corrupt politician called Cameron. Lincoln said that the only thing that Cameron wouldn't steal from a room was a hot stove. Cameron is credited with the phrase that an honest and loyal politician is one who, when bought, stays bought. And he was a corrupt politician for a long period in the 19th century. And he was driven by money, by power, by glory, and by greed. And if you think of it, those are some of the motivations which, unfortunately, we can find in sport. Those are some of the things that are behind this psychology of cheating. Now, when I was asked to do this by Kim, I thought it was quite interesting because I do a lot of disciplinary hearings. And in disciplinary hearings, you usually hear from both sides about what happened. You hear from both sides about how this should be dealt with. But you actually rarely hear why the infraction was done. Why did the guilty party behave as they did? We rarely debrief, if you like, on that. From a criminal investigation point of view, we hear a lot about the means, we hear a lot about the opportunity, but we rarely actually hear about the motive, the why. Now, I'm sure, if we did a kind of an online or straw poll here very quickly, you'll say, well, it's money, isn't it? Or it's glory, or it's fame. And that's true. But when you dig down to it into a bit more, it's slightly more complicated than that. And I think what's interesting is when you understand the motive, well, then you can develop ways of preventing it in the future. Now, just very quickly, cheating in sport has obviously gone on for a very, very long time, almost since the beginning. I can give you many examples, some from state-sponsored cheating, right down to individual, examples, which are quite quaint and sometimes a bit silly. So some of the examples here, this is one of the most famous ones on the bottom right of the screen. This is Rosie Ruiz, who in a 1980 Boston Marathon cheated to win. It's a dramatic photo. You can see the sweat coming down the t-shirt. The cops are worried that she'll collapse. She hopped over the barrier a mile from the finish to win. She cheated. And we never quite understood why. She was interviewed immediately after the race. She didn't even understand what interval training was. But she wanted the glory of that moment. And we've seen that kind of unusual type of cheating many times. The top one is a racing one, which is a fairly famous racing incident from Louisiana at one of these racetracks that was covered in fog. And the jockey hid the horse in the fog and won by 23 lengths on the second round. But it's an interesting example, because it's one of the first examples of a jockey being prosecuted and convicted for fraud relating to cheating at sport. Other examples, the top example is from fencing in the 1970s in the Olympics, whereby the Russian fencer puts a small little electronic tag on the top of the sword, or whatever they call it in fencing. So he just has to press a button. He doesn't even have to touch an opponent, and it registers a score. And he was found out. Extraordinary cheating in the middle of the Olympics. But why did he do it? For those of you working in integrity, you'll see the profile. Coming towards the end of his career, one last opportunity to win a medal under severe pressure from the Soviet state to perform, and then cheated in an extraordinary way. And staying with major technology, here is one of the most famous phone boxes in Ireland. This is a very famous gambling scam in racing from the 1970s in Ireland, which essentially consisted of a rural track where there was only one phone box out, which limited the betting company's ability to set the starting price. The scam was that one of the conspirators got into the phone box and went on a long phone call with his aunt, which delayed matters and allowed the scam to complete. So it's just, an example of cheating, cheating done for money. And there are many other examples. I'm not going to talk about fine cotton in Australia, but I will talk about one of the more extraordinary ones. This is the Spanish Paralympic basketball team, which won gold at the 2000 Sydney Olympics. The category they were in was the intellectually disabled category. I think only about 2 of the team genuinely were intellectually disabled. And in fact, when this photo was broadcast back in Spain, it was revealed that most of them were well-known club basketball players. They cheated for a gold medal to that extent. And it was an extraordinary issue that went to the courts thereafter. And the motivation was that the chief administrator of the Spanish Basketball Association in question was under pressure for funding from the government and needed success, and therefore came up with the conspiracy. So they're just, some examples that we can come up with. And I think a theme that's running through them is, of course, money. As Lance Armstrong said, the faster I pedal, the quicker I retire. And the motivation for his doping conspiracy was not just the fame and the glory, but it was, of course, the money, which drove him on in one of the great, if you like, conspiracies. Now, what's interesting about Armstrong, and this may come up later on, is the self-justification that he used Well, everyone was cheating. I just happened to be better at it. It was the regulator's fault for not applying the rules strictly. Okay? The peloton, as he said, is like a knife fight. I just happened to bring a gun. That was his view. And if you see the self-justification here, now the interesting thing is, he won 7 Tour de France. They stripped him of his titles. Who replaced him? No one. Because they couldn't justify, given the amount of doping that occurred at the time, of putting someone in his position. So think about that. Think about that sport in the 2000s and what it put itself through. So that's one, money and the self-justification that goes into it. There are other kind of conspiracies that are grander than this. We see certain countries that use sport as a propaganda tool and, irrespective of the health of their athletes, drive them, usually through doping, to achieve gold medals. For me, growing up, the big one was East Germany. 18 million people only. In 1976 Olympics, came 3rd on the medal table. 1988 Olympics in Seoul, 3rd on the medal table. And dominated many sports throughout that period by doping. And the health implications on the athletes have been extreme. In fact, listening to the comments of the East German athletes commenting now on the claims against Russia, their focus is on the health of the athletes, which is an interesting thing. And the idea that regulators have to be strict in a paternalistic way. The quote up on the slide there is, German female swimmers were given industrial scales of doping substances, and it had severe impact on them physiologically. One of the impacts was they had very deep voices, and this comment was made to an East German coach who responded, "We came here to swim, not to sing." He didn't care. They just drove it on. So there's 2 examples, money and the kind of state aggrandizement issue. The second issue is simply people cheat because it's a win-at-all-cost mentality. It's almost a reflexive thing. It's, the scorpion in the animal fable. It's just in my nature. And one of the famous examples of cheating in sport is obviously Diego Maradona against England, which, being Irish, I thought was absolutely hilarious until 2010, when Thierry Henry did exactly the same thing to the Republic of Ireland. Okay? But that was instinctive, reflective of this win-at-all-costs mentality. And some then have a win-at-all-costs mentality, but they're almost more premeditated about this. And although doping offenses now are a default of 4 years, previously they were down to 2 years. And for many dopers, cheaters, they looked at the equation. Well, what's the chance of getting caught? If only 2% of tests are positive, well, the chances are pretty low. Even if I do get caught, 2 years maximum, which some treated as a career break. And what are the benefits I can get? Well, there's a lot. Because some of these substances, and you'll see it with horses as well, some of these substances work. Doping works. They do it for a reason. So that's an interesting one. And it comes up in so many ways, not just in the self-justification way, but also what you could call the legalization point, which I think is an interesting point for sport, which is, if we take, say, doping in animal or human, you have a prohibited list. But if you discover, that's only a minority, but if you discover a substance that's not on that list, is it legal to take? The ethics and morals are secondary for some people. They will say, it's not banned, it's legal to take. no matter what. And that legalization issue, that rigid way of looking things, is something that we have to look out for in sport generally. And one interesting thing that I find with this is, and it brings some of these points together, it's a bit like the whip rule in racing. So many times you can use the whip, say in the straight or whatever it is. If you're on the big one, in a big race, as a jockey, what's going through your mind? It's interesting sometimes to hear jockeys afterwards talk about that, almost accept the fine, given what's at stake. And it's an interesting kind of an ethical point on that. Two other examples, I had to mention the cricket, is in team sports, there's often a slightly different dynamic. Even in cycling with Lance Armstrong, we saw this, that one or two characters can dominate and other team members are quite incurious about what's happening. And an example of this is obviously here the Australian sandpaper scandal, which happened only a few kilometers away from here. The Australians cheating with sandpaper and the resulting ban of the players for a year. And what's interesting about that is we see that in many other sports. So for example, huge scandal at the minute in America, in the US, with baseball and sign stealing by the Astros. Did they benefit from that and win World Series? So it's an interesting one about cheating in sport. And what's interesting, and this is typical of the US, but many of the players who were affected by the cheating by the Houston Astros, some of them have now taken legal cases claiming damage for the loss that's suffered. And it's something to watch out for in future with athletes, with people denied prize winners winning money by cheaters, that they're looking at the legal route for compensation. So there's an example. And then unfortunately, Hansi Cronje on the right, and that question why 20 years ago he did what he did. Do we really still understand why he did it? But they're interesting examples of that. So just to kind of drill down into it a little bit more, the main one obviously is money. And the main driver sometimes is, for cheating, unfortunately, is money. But if we look at some of the big scandals in sport over history, and including in racing, there's something slightly different to it. So one of the biggest scandals in world sport was a baseball World Series from 1919 that was fixed. The motivation for the players, they felt they weren't being paid properly. Pakistan, 2010, Test series against England in Lords. Pakistan players, spot fixed. The difference in salary between what the Pakistan players were earning and what the English players were earning were multiples. It's not an excuse, it's not a justification, but it gives you some insight. In tennis, which has significant problems with match fixing comes from the lower levels. Outside of the top 100 seeds, the amount of money that earned is quite minimal. These people are vulnerable. What about racing? What about the competitive balance in racing? The big trainers, the big owners, and then those who don't earn as much. Are they the vulnerable ones? Is that where the source comes from? So those are kind of interesting things. That's about the money. The second thing is the glory and the fame, if you like, and the point I made earlier about regulators have to be paternalistic. You have to intervene. We see it with concussion. We see it with jockey welfare. We see it with doping. Athletes, rightly or wrongly, tend to have a real-time appreciation of their body. The next race, the next event. And regulators have to intervene and are justified in intervening. Okay? And one of the big issues, even in racing, is with concussion. And a lot of sports now are using what's called concussion subs, contact sports, so you can replace someone who's concussed. But there are worries about that because they are worried that certain teams will cheat with that, abuse the system. So you think of the pressures that regulators are under. So what do we learn from all of this? Just in the 5 minutes or so that are left, what do we learn about and from the why? Well, there's lots we can learn. I think the first thing that we have to learn is, obviously, your risk assessment of any sport has to be dynamic. There are new threats coming on all the time. That's definitely. But one interesting thing is that who defines cheating? The sport defines cheating, which is an interesting power for sport. Not all athletes. In fact, the vast majority of athletes do the right thing. And sometimes do we overemphasize those who cheat? And sometimes do we fail to reward good behavior? And I think we have to be careful with the attitude sometimes that some regulators have, that it's a them and us. That's one thing. The second, just going through it, the second thing, just to pick out, because I'm conscious of time, is that more and more we're tending to use technology to catch cheating. And we have to be a little bit careful about that and the powers that we're giving to regulators over athletes with regard to privacy and data protection. Just listen about that. And 2 or 3 final points. The next one is education. We talk a lot about how we educate athletes, how we educate jockeys. And are we doing it properly? Or are we just pawning it off to online or token one-day events we meet every now and then? I think we need to focus very much on that and on the ethical side of education. And 2 final points. We also talk about whistleblowing. Sport is not very good at whistleblowing. The sports community is small. And the smaller the community, the louder they hear you whistle. So we have to think about better ways all the time of whistleblowing. And the final thing, just to bring it all, I could pick up on various points of that, and I'm happy to discuss it later with the questions. But the final point is, I like racing. I'm Irish, it's in the Constitution. And racing, great strength is that it has a long history of dealing with these issues. The original word for match fixing was a 19th century word in US baseball. It was called hippodroming. And hippodroming relates to ancient cheating in racing. That was the original phrase for match fixing. So racing has a long history in that. That's its greatest strength. Its greatest weakness is that it has a long history of dealing with cheating as well. And sometimes you take the structures you have for granted. And in that, it's interesting always to see that when racing is presented with challenges like animal welfare, like race rigging, there is a tendency to circle the wagons and say it's an external threat. It's not. The biggest threat to the integrity of the great sport of racing actually comes from inside. And that's true of many other sports. And with that, I just want to leave you with one quote. And it's a quote from an Australian army officer about certain issues that arose, difficult issues that arose with the culture in the Australian army. And one of the points he made was, yes, you can have your structures. Yes, you can have your good governance, and rightly so. But integrity is also a personal responsibility. And the personal responsibility, and how he put it, was that the standard you walk by is the standard you accept. We've all got to take responsibility for the better integrity of our sports. Thanks very much.